This time on Ask Rad Rat, we're talking about impossibles versus 360 shove-its and when downhill and longboarding broke off from traditional skating. Let's get started. Welcome to Rad Rat Video. Here on this channel, every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, I release a new video about a topic from somewhere in the skateboarding world. So game reviews, trick histories, and I answer your questions on this series, Ask Rad Rat. Today we got two questions that I want to discuss. The first, I've been getting a lot from a lot of different people. I usually don't talk about does this count type of stuff anymore, but so many people have asked, I want to cover it. Most recently asked by 1234Pi95, want to know impossibles versus 360 shove-its. Where's the line? How do you decide which is which? Now, the reason I picked this one to answer is also because I have kind of a different perspective on it that I wanted to get out there. So the argument you see a lot is if someone does like a 360 shove and their toe kind of touches it, does that really count? You know, their foot's in contact, but does it really wrap? All that kind of stuff. One of the most, like the biggest argument you'll see is that people say impossibles need to be vertical. That's the trick, it has to be vertical. And that's because originally the idea of an impossible was that it was impossible to make the board flip backwards. And the thing is, that's not really true. If you watch my video on the history of the impossible, the idea of it actually came from doing a front flip with the board, sort of like a vertical front foot impossible. That was the discussion that spawned Rodney Mullen to think about the trick and eventually invent it. But that doesn't really matter. That's a discussion that took place 40 years ago. That's not what the trick actually became. So vertical impossibles are really cool. I'm into them. But for me, what really makes an impossible good is when you change the plane of momentum. So for me, the way I do them, the board starts kind of vertical but ends flat. And the reason why I like that is because you're actually pushing the board and changing the way it moves. So it starts in one direction, changes in the air because of the way that you move your foot around and you pull it with you. If you make the board do a 360 shove and your toes kind of touching it, or if you make the board do a perfect backflip and your toes just kind of touching it, either way for me doesn't quite feel right. They still count as impossibles, they're just not the most legit, the most cool looking, the most best feeling that you can come up with, in my opinion. But you know, again, if you're doing this motion and your foot's most of the way in contact, it counts, it's just not the best one, that's it. Second question is from David Gonzalez, and this is a really good one. I sat on this question for a while trying to come up with a good way to answer it. He asks about how did downhill and longboarding drift apart from traditional skating? And I thought that was a really good question because in my research, if you go far enough back, you'll see that skating was just skating. Everyone did everything. And it's interesting, like Tony Hawk, so he would place in a vert contest in like 1982. He would do the vert competition and then he would go do a freestyle run in the freestyle competition. And he might have done the slalom and that kind of stuff too. I noticed the freestyle specifically, but you would just kind of do everything. You would cross train, you would learn how to do all kinds of different skating because it was just skating. And then that slowly changed over time. But one thing I found really, really interesting. So there's a guy named Bob Lofton. You may recognize the name. He ran Bob's Trick Tips, the first trick tip website way back in the day. Nowadays, he runs a podcast called the Freestyle Podcast, talks about freestyle skating, events, and news and all that kind of stuff. But one thing he mentioned casually on that podcast before was that he had a friend back in the day in the 80s, and he was so good that he had already learned this year's new tricks by, you know, mid-spring, whatever it was. And that comment just really stood out to me, really blew my mind that like there's new tricks this year. Because for me, I started in 2001. Think of all the brand new tricks that came out since 2001. Maybe like 360 forward flips. I'm not sure what else. Pretty much everything had already existed when I started skating. But if you think about back in the day, you know, you're a pool skater, you're a vert skater or whatever, and Neil Blender invents the lean grab. And you see it in Thrasher, and then you go out and learn it, and then what? So it's kind of interesting, like it seems that there was more ability to go out and do different things because there wasn't as much going on. You know, you learned this year's new tricks, and then what do? You try to learn the new tricks from this discipline. Now you try to learn all the new freestyle tricks. And that was something that I thought was just really, really interesting. So you see guys like Tony Hawk doing freestyle events and things like that, but it doesn't last very long. So you get into the mid 80s and you still see it a little bit. It's funny to watch early or mid 80s, like early street competitions. You'll see guys just get some speed and then they'll just like turn around. And then they'll go this way, then they'll turn around. Then they'll boneless over a little parking block. And that's it. It wasn't crazy competitive, like best tricks in the world. And I think a lot of that comes from the way things were filmed. I've talked about that before. Back in the day, there was an interview with somebody recently, but it was about way back, how it was more about getting like a professional camera, getting a cool camera angle of a basic trick. That would make the videos rather than a really hard trick just filmed by your buddy. So a lot of it was more about just the way it looked and the feel and things like that versus actually showing off really good tricks. And so as things progressed into the late 80s, you start to see more like really heavily focused trick stuff, more competitive, like, you know, trying to be the first to do this and this and whatever. And at that point, I think that's when you start to see people narrow in more on their own thing. So you're trying to be the only guy on vert. You're not wasting your time practicing a freestyle run because vert is your main thing. Or you're the freestyle guy, or you're the downhill guy, or whatever it is that you're doing. You focus more on that. As the skill level is going up, you have to focus more. So for me, I would say probably about the late 80s is when you started to see people really pick their one thing. And then not that many people picked the downhill and the longboarding, and that's why it kind of splintered off a little bit. So I looked up the history of longboards, and they were around in the 50s. It was one of the earliest things. You know, the more like a surfboard you could get, the better. So you get a really long board, and they kind of died out as the trick stuff came in, and they came back around the early 90s is when the site I found said they started to get popular again. So to answer your question, I think it was probably around the late 80s it broke off and became its own thing more in the 90s, but I think that's kind of the reason why. But that's it for this time. Ask all of your questions below. And until next time, here's some more videos you may want to check out. And check back every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday for a new video and all kinds of different series that I do. Subscribe so you don't miss anything right here. Thank you for watching.